For it was not just an important trading center, but also a place of mystery and legend, a garden of immortality. But where was Dilmun? Men have been looking for Dilmun for 100 years, ever since its name was unearthed by archaeology a century ago. One man now thinks he's actually found it, an archaeologist called Geoffrey Bibby. And thereby he reckons he has also found paradise, the source of the biblical story of the Garden of Eden. He looks like some Arab sheikh, but actually he's an Englishman from Westmoreland who happens to work in Denmark. His quest for Dilmun took him to the Middle East, to an island in the Arabian Gulf, the oil-rich island of Bahrain, where archaeology and legend finally met face to face and started to make sense. It all started with the puzzle of the grave mounds. For years, scholars had believed that Bahrain had been used in prehistoric times simply as a cemetery, a vast necropolis for the peoples of mainland Arabia. Geoffrey Bibby and his Danish colleagues didn't find this theory convincing. There was very little evidence to go on. All the mounds that were archaeologically examined had been plundered by grave robbers in antiquity, so not much was known of the culture of those who had been buried there.
I bet it is, but still.
Digging them is apt to be a dusty, unrewarding business, but in the search for evidence, it must be done.
As good as any of them. Put the first one in there, I think. Yeah.
The chances of finding an unrobbed grave must be 1,000 to 1 at least. Yet every excavation, every mound they tackle, has to be meticulously recorded and surveyed. For in archaeology, every single detail can be vital.
Okay, now we start digging. ايه ونشيل الرمل هناك شمالي يلا عشان
Bibby knows before he starts that this is almost sure to be an academic exercise. After nearly 20 seasons in Bahrain, he knows better than to expect spectacular results from the field of grave mounds, any more than in the royal graves at Ali. The mounds at Ali are huge. Compared with the normal grave mounds, which are seldom more than the height of a man, the Ali mounds are as big as 3-story buildings. Each one has 2 huge chambers with carefully plastered walls. But these mounds, too, had been systematically robbed in antiquity. Faced with these colossal structures, with no evidence to go on except some broken pottery and beakers, Bibby and his colleagues came to the conclusion that they had once housed royalty, that this area was Bahrain's equivalent of the Valley of the Kings in Egypt.
They were obviously at least 3,000 years old. And we believe that they must mean that Bahrain had been, at some time in the past, a pretty important place.
Such were the homes of the dead. But what of the living? The first clue that Bahrain had been more than just a cemetery came from a number of chimneys that stuck out of the sand, a remarkable sight. They formed a line that led straight across the arid expanse of sand towards a walled enclosure. And inside, a sunken garden, a man-made oasis of growth now parched and desiccated, struggling to keep alive against the encroaching sand. It was an extraordinary thing to find in the middle of the desert, especially since there was not one but several of them. The question was, what on earth had it really been for?
Well, essentially, it's the source of an irrigation system. It's a natural spring, which is led through artificial underground channels down a few miles to the villages near the coast, where it's used for irrigation purposes.
So what were these chimneys that lead here? Inspection holes or something like that?
Yes, mainly. The channels need clearing out periodically. I think they were also used in actually in digging the channels.
The fascinating point emerged that the irrigation system had been built in the days before Bahrain had become a desert. The walls had been erected to keep the encroaching sand from smothering the spring. It gave some indication at least of how old this sunken garden must have been.
We knew it was a quite considerable age because it had been given up. The water table had sunk since it was built, and the water no longer reached the water channels. So we reckoned that it must be at least 2,000 years old, say, very roughly. The important thing wasn't perhaps how old it was, but the fact that it did show that there'd been people living here, that there'd been an agricultural community with a very well-organized water supply at some unspecified remote date in the past. And that made quite a difference to our picture of the island. And I think it was the first evidence we had that the theory that Bahrain was merely a desert island that was used as a burial place for people from outside just couldn't hold water.
The sunken garden had proved that people had lived on Bahrain. A mound near the village of Barbar to the north indicated where they had worshipped. This was the first large site the expedition tackled. What had attracted their attention originally was the fact that they had come across two squared stones protruding from the mound. It was the leader of the expedition, Professor Peter Globe, who was responsible for the dig. They sank a trench right through the middle, and almost at once they realized they had a major archaeological discovery on their hands. What they had found was a temple, huge squared stone walls, a stone altar, and in front of it, a pit full of votive offerings. One of them, a little figurine of a naked man about 6 inches high, his hands clasped in prayer. Another was a copper figurine of a plump bird. But the most significant find was a magnificent bull's head in copper, because by comparing it with bull's heads found throughout the Middle East, this find enabled the archaeologists for the first time to estimate the date of this civilization. The one it resembled most closely was a celebrated bull's head found by Sir Leonard Woolley on a lyre at Ur of the Chaldees. It showed that the Temple of Barbar had clear cultural connections with the ancient civilization of Sumeria at around 2000 BC. With this knowledge came the first realization that they might be looking at the long-lost, almost legendary world of Dilmun. When the temple had yielded its secrets, the site was covered over again with sand to preserve it for posterity and to discourage stone robbers who would have looted it for construction materials, for stone is scarce in Bahrain. And now, having discovered where the people of ancient Bahrain had worshipped, the next question facing Bibby was to find out where they had actually lived. From the mound at Barbar, they turned to the so-called Bahrain Fort, a ruined fortress built by the Portuguese in the early 16th century. It was Professor Peter Globe who discovered the next lead when he started examining the fort site properly.
It's surrounded on all sides by a raised hillock, about 30 feet high perhaps. And you can see still the outlines of walls running along the surface. And I suppose everybody had previously considered that these walls belonged to the time of the Portuguese. But considering it, Professor Globe decided that actually this could hardly be true. The towers of the fort had gun ports and arrow ports, and obviously there could not have been a town there at that time that would obstruct the field of fire. And it was quite obvious that what we had here was a tell.
A tell is an artificial mound built up of various layers of cities and civilizations. The Danes started digging. Almost at once, about 3 feet down, they came across massive stone walls lying at an angle.
We went down inside the wall. It cut down our sondage to about half the area, and there was only room, in fact, for Professor Globe and one of his men to work inside the limited area. And from there, they went down. Each day when we came along in the evening, they were another couple of feet down, and it just went down and down. We got no idea that we'd find walls of this massiveness, this completeness,
What did you find at the bottom?
Well, about 15 feet down, we found a floor. It's been dug away now. And in that floor, there were two holes. When we dug down in those, there were two bathtub-shaped coffins, sarcophagi of clay, with skeletons curled up inside.
Did that tell you anything about
Well, that was the first indication of date. We got no idea of the date of these walls then, but the coffins we knew. They had to be of Neo-Babylonian or Assyrian date, somewhere around 700 BC, perhaps. The trouble was that they were buried, as I say, through holes in the floor, so they were presumably not so old as the building in which they stood. So the building could be any date still, but it had to be older.
How did you eventually get round to dating the whole site?
Well, that didn't happen here, because here there wasn't room, because of the walls, to make a deep sondage. We went over to the edge of the tell, and there we dug a hole all the way down to bedrock.
The results certainly proved that it was a tell, but they proved far more. The profile of the sondage showed a series of strata with pottery associated with 3 different civilizations. At the top level there was Greek pottery, then Kassite, and at the bottom Barbar pottery, the same previously unknown dark red pottery found at the Barbar temple. It proved that people who worshipped there had also lived here.
Pottery is, in fact, the most important thing that the archaeologist has through his hands. It's the most common thing, and that's one reason for its importance. It's the odd thing about pottery that while it's intensely fragile, once it's broken, the shards never deteriorate, and while all organic material, even metal, disappears, you do get tens of thousands of shards. And because clay is so malleable, you do tend to get all sorts of shapes, all sorts of colors, all sorts of designs, and practically speaking, they never repeat themselves. So that if you get the same shape of pottery in 2 different sites, you can be fairly sure that those 2 sites are of the same date and of the same culture.
And so, for the first time in 4,000 years, a Barbar pot was seen in its original shape. A long-necked pot, but fundamentally egg-shaped. And round it were chains of deep ridges formed by the potter pinching the clay with his fingers. The most common type of Barbar pot was even more elongated, unable to stand on its own base, and thick-rimmed at the neck. And finally, the sherds of a grave mound pot, of different shape, but the same deep red color. So the people who were buried in the grave mounds were the people who had worshipped at Barbar and lived at the fort site. The puzzle of the grave mounds was solved. But now a new and even more tantalizing question arose. For on a seashore on the south of the island, they found a great heap of oyster shells, and amongst them the familiar telltale red pottery of Barbar. So the oyster shells were 4,500 years old, and in them Bibby felt an echo of ancient Dilmun, for Dilmun had been famous for its pearls. And now the memory of a legend went through his mind, a legend that linked Dilmun and Samaria. For in the Sumerian town of Uruk, 3,000 years before Christ, there had lived a king who was part man, part god. His name was Gilgamesh.
A goddess made him, strong as a savage bull. None can withstand his arms.
No human could stand up to him. So for sport, Gilgamesh would take on bulls and lions. The city of Uruk stood in awe of him and begged the gods to create someone to match his fearful strength. And so the gods created another monster, half man and half bull, to be his match. After some fighting, the two became bosom friends and shared a lifetime of adventures together. But when his companion died, Gilgamesh went to Dilmun to visit Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, the only human being who knew the secret of immortality which the gods had bestowed on him for saving mankind from the flood. Gilgamesh traveled by boat exactly the same kind of buoyant reed boat that the men of Bahrain use to this day. So Gilgamesh came to Dilmun to beg from Noah the secret of immortality.
Gilgamesh, I shall reveal a secret thing. It is a mystery of the gods that I'm telling you. There is a plant that grows under the water. It has a prickle like a thorn, like a rose. It will wound your hands. But if you succeed in taking it, then your hands will hold that which restores his lost youth to a man.
The flower of immortality was the pearl. From time immemorial, the pearlers of Bahrain have dived for oyster shells by tying weights to their feet to pull them down to the seabed. And this was precisely the method that Noah advised Gilgamesh to adopt. To pluck the flower of immortality, Gilgamesh sank to the seabed like a pearl diver and took the plant or pearl and brought it to the surface. And with the secret in his hand, he took his leave of Noah. But he was not to keep the secret for long, for on his journey out of Dilmun,
Gilgamesh saw a well of cool water, and he went down and bathed. But deep in the pool there was lying a serpent, and the serpent sensed the sweetness of the flower. It rose out of the water and snatched it away, and immediately it shed its skin and returned to the well.
And so, just as in the Bible, man held the secret of immortality and then lost it to the serpent.